A millionaire scoffed at a poor former employee who filed a lawsuit against his company. But when the judge started speaking, he turned pale because the ruling would make him lose everything. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as William Carter adjusted his expensive cufflinks, exuding the arrogance that had defined his entire career. He sat in his chair with an air of boredom, his sharp blue eyes sweeping over the room like a king surveying his court. This was a waste of time. To his right, Ethan Brooks sat stiffly, his fingers anxiously intertwined on the wooden table. His suit was cheap, slightly wrinkled, a stark contrast to William's tailored perfection. Ethan's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, whispered something to him, but Ethan barely responded. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. William smirked. The nerve of this man. Ethan had been nothing more than a low-level employee in his corporation, a nameless worker and easily replaceable. His termination had been standard procedure, a mere adjustment in numbers. And now, here he was, suing Carter Enterprises for wrongful dismissal. Pathetic. William leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence. He had been through lawsuits before, minor inconveniences brushed aside by his elite legal team. He could already picture how this would play out. The judge would dismiss the case, his lawyers would handle the formalities, and by the end of the day, he'd be drinking a $2,000 bottle of scotch in his penthouse. His gaze flicked toward Ethan, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his knuckles were white from gripping the table. William chuckled under his breath. "You really thought you could take me down, didn't you?" he murmured just loud enough for Ethan to hear. Ethan flinched but said nothing. The courtroom doors swung open, and a hush fell over the room as the judge entered. Sarah Montgomery. William had dealt with her before, a sharp-minded woman, but nothing he couldn't handle. She adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable, before taking her seat at the bench. "All rise," the bailiff announced. William rose lazily, adjusting his tie, already eager for this farce to be over. Little did he know, the moment Judge Montgomery opened her mouth, his world would start to crumble. William Carter sat back down, exuding the same confident indifference that had carried him through dozens of legal skirmishes. In his world, power wasn't just about money, it was about control. He controlled his company, his employees, even the people he did business with. And he was certain he controlled the outcome of this case. Judge Sarah Montgomery cleared her throat. The courtroom fell silent. Ethan Brooks, sitting a few feet away, barely breathed. His fingers drummed nervously against the table, and he avoided eye contact with William. The contrast between the two men was almost laughable. Ethan looked like he had been worn down by life, while William, dressed in a pristine navy blue suit worth more than Ethan's entire apartment, looked untouchable. William barely concealed his smirk. This would be over in minutes. "Mr. Brooks," Judge Montgomery began, adjusting her glasses, "has presented compelling evidence regarding his wrongful termination. After reviewing the details of this case, the court has found that Carter Enterprises engaged in unlawful labor practices, including—" William's smirk faltered. "Including?" He shifted in his chair, suddenly more attentive. "Unjust dismissals, failure to provide severance as required by law, and manipulation of performance reviews to eliminate long-term employees in order to avoid pension payouts." A murmur spread through the room. William felt a flicker of irritation. This was ridiculous. Every corporation had to cut costs. How else did they think he maintained his empire? Judge Montgomery continued, her voice firm. "As such, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff." For the first time in years, William's breath caught in his throat. "Furthermore," she added, flipping to another page of her notes, "Carter Enterprises will be required to pay a settlement of $48.6 million in damages and fines." Silence. William froze. For the first time since entering this courtroom, he felt something he hadn't in a very long time. Dread. He barely registered the gasps in the room, the whispered conversations, or even the way Ethan's lawyer placed a reassuring hand on his client's shoulder. $48.6 million. This was not just a slap on the wrist. This was an execution. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. He turned toward his lawyers, expecting them to object, but they sat stiffly, exchanging uneasy glances. "Your Honor," one of them finally spoke, "we intend to appeal this decision." Judge Montgomery held up a hand. "I'm not finished." William's stomach churned. The Department of Labor has launched an additional investigation into Carter Enterprises following this case. If their findings confirm a pattern of misconduct, criminal charges may be pursued against Mr. Carter and several executives within his company. William's vision blurred at the edges. Criminal charges? This was beyond money. This was his freedom at stake. A cold sweat formed at the base of his neck. He looked around, desperate to find a way out of this nightmare. But no one met his gaze. Not his lawyers, not his executives seated in the back of the room, and certainly not Ethan Brooks, who sat frozen, his face a mixture of shock and overwhelming relief. William's hands clenched into fists under the table. This was impossible. But as Judge Montgomery called for order and banged her gavel, the reality set in. His empire was crumbling. William Carter stormed out of the courtroom, his hands clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. The world outside seemed strangely muted. The usual roar of downtown traffic, the distant chatter of pedestrians, the hum of the city he once ruled, all of it blurred into meaningless noise. He barely noticed the reporters swarming him, their cameras flashing like relentless lightning strikes. "Mr. Carter, do you have a statement about today's verdict? What will happen to Carter Enterprises after this ruling? Are you prepared to pay the $48 million settlement? Is it true the Department of Labor is investigating further misconduct in your company?" William ignored them, his pace quick and deliberate as he made his way to the waiting black limousine. His driver opened the door, and he slid inside, slamming it shut behind him. The moment the car pulled away, he exhaled sharply and yanked off his tie, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Across from him sat Richard Langley, his lead attorney. Richard, a man usually as confident as William himself, looked rattled. He rubbed his temples before finally speaking. "This is bad, William." William scoffed. "No kidding, Richard. This is worse than you think." William's glare sharpened. "What the hell does that mean?" Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice as if the walls of the limo had ears. "It's not just about the $48 million. William already knew that, but he waited, his patience running dangerously thin. The Department of Labor's investigation is moving fast. They have records of altered employee evaluations, documents showing a deliberate pattern of cutting staff to avoid paying pensions. If they find enough—" "They won't," William interrupted, though there was an unmistakable tightness in his voice. Richard hesitated before continuing. "If they do, you could be facing charges of fraud and corporate misconduct. They could freeze your assets while the case unfolds." William's fingers twitched. Freeze his assets? That would be catastrophic. His wealth wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was leverage, power, control. He owned penthouses in New York and London, a fleet of luxury cars, and enough investments to keep him at the top of the food chain. But all of that required liquidity. If his assets were frozen, everything could spiral out of control. Richard studied him carefully. "You need to prepare for the worst." William let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "The worst?" "Richard, this isn't the worst. The worst would be me sitting in a goddamn prison cell." Richard's silence was damning. The car came to a halt outside Carter Tower, the heart of his empire. A 50-story skyscraper of steel and glass, its massive golden logo gleamed against the sky. Normally, seeing his name at the top of that building filled him with a sense of power. Today, it felt like a target. As he stepped into the lobby, he noticed the way his employees whispered among themselves, eyes darting in his direction before quickly looking away. Fear. Doubt. Weakness. The sharks were circling. The first sign of real damage came the next morning. William sat in his penthouse office, coffee steaming beside him, watching the news coverage of his downfall play out on national television. Billionaire William Carter loses landmark lawsuit. Ex-employee wins $48 million settlement in major labor rights case. Carter Enterprises under federal investigation. The headlines were brutal. Then his assistant, Vanessa, entered, looking pale. "Sir, you need to see this." She placed a tablet in front of him. On the screen was an email, an urgent message from the board of directors. William scanned the words, his expression darkening with every line. "William, given the severity of the situation and the financial risk Carter Enterprises now faces, we are calling for an emergency board meeting. There is growing concern among shareholders about your ability to lead the company through this crisis. We need to discuss a course of action, immediately." William slammed the tablet onto his desk. "They want me out," he muttered. Vanessa hesitated. I don't know if that's what they mean, sir. But they're definitely worried." He could feel it happening. The board was turning against him. The investors were panicking. If they voted to remove him as CEO, he would lose his greatest source of power. His phone buzzed. A text from Martin Greer, one of his closest business allies. "We need to talk. Investors are pulling out. This could get worse, fast." A second buzz. Another text, this time from his private banker. "William, we have a situation. Call me ASAP." His stomach twisted. He grabbed his phone and called immediately. "Talk." The banker sighed on the other end. "Your accounts are being flagged for review. Given the government investigation, some of your assets might be temporarily frozen." William shot up from his chair. "Temporarily. For now. But if they file criminal charges, I won't let it get to that." He ended the call and hurled his phone across the room. This was the beginning of his ruin. And for the first time in his life, William Carter wasn't sure if he could stop it. The emergency board meeting was a war zone. William Carter sat at the head of the long glass conference table, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Across from him, a row of his own executives, men who had once begged for his approval, now stared at him with cold, calculating eyes. Martin Greer, his longest-standing ally on the board, was the first to speak. "William, this is serious." William exhaled sharply. "No shit, Martin. The lawsuit, the fines, the federal investigation, it's all too much," Martin continued. "We've already lost key investors, and if this continues, Carter Enterprises could collapse within months." William folded his arms. "And what's your brilliant solution? You want me to step down?" A tense silence filled the room. Then Daniel Mercer, one of the younger, more ambitious board members, leaned forward. "We're asking you to consider it, William." "Consider it?" William repeated, his voice dangerously low. "This isn't personal," Mercer said smoothly, though his eyes betrayed his hunger for power. "It's about survival. Investors need reassurance. Stock prices are plummeting. The media is tearing us apart. If you voluntarily step down, we might be able to salvage." William slammed his fist against the table. The shock wave of sound echoed across the room. "I built this empire. I made every one of you richer than you ever dreamed. And now you want to throw me to the wolves." Martin sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's not about loyalty, William. It's about business. If we don't act fast, there won't be a company left to save." William's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He could see it unfolding. The whispers, the secret meetings, the silent power plays happening right in front of him. They weren't just considering removing him. They had already decided. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not stepping down." Mercer exchanged a glance with the others. Then we'll be forced to take a vote. The words hit like a gunshot. A vote. A formal vote of no confidence from the board would remove him as CEO. He could fight it, drag it into legal battles, but he knew the truth. The moment investors lost faith, his empire would shatter. Still, his pride wouldn't let him back down. He stared them down, one by one. Fine. Vote. Martin hesitated, then nodded. All those in favor of William Carter stepping down as CEO of Carter Enterprises, raise your hand. William watched as, one by one, hands went up. Mercer. Then another. Then another. Until the room became a forest of betrayal. 7 against 1. Martin was the only one who kept his hand down, though his expression told William that it was only out of pity. William felt a twist of rage deep in his gut. These cowards! He had made them powerful, wealthy, and now they were turning on him like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Martin sighed heavily. William, it's done. William stood, slowly, every movement controlled. No, it's not. He turned to Mercer, his piercing gaze unwavering. Enjoy your new position, Mercer. But understand this, you will never be me. With that, he walked out, his entire world crumbling behind him. The beginning of the end. William's security access was revoked within hours. By the next morning, his name was being stripped from office walls, his corner suite was emptied, and new passwords locked him out of every system. Just like that, the empire he had spent decades building no longer belonged to him. And the worst part? It was only the beginning. His private banker called before noon. William, I don't know how to say this, but you need to prepare yourself. For what? The banker hesitated, and for the first time in his life, William felt fear seep into his bones. Several of your offshore accounts have been frozen. William stopped breathing. More than that, your corporate assets are locked. Your credit lines are cut off. Investors are pulling funding, and the board is in talks to liquidate stock options to cover the settlement. You don't have access to your own fortune. A heavy silence hung in the air. How much do I have left? William finally asked. The banker hesitated. Personal accounts. You still have around $12 million in liquid cash. William exhaled sharply. That wasn't ideal, but it was something. However, the banker added, his voice tense, if criminal charges are filed, even those funds could be frozen. William felt the room tilt around him. Are you telling me I could lose everything? The banker hesitated. I'm saying you need a backup plan. A backup plan. 4 years, William had been untouchable. Now, in the span of days, his empire was gone. His name tarnished, his wealth slipping through his fingers like sand. And worst of all, his enemies could already smell blood in the water. The headlines the next morning were brutal. Former billionaire William Carter faces financial collapse amid scandal. From king to pauper, the downfall of William Carter. Authorities expand investigation into Carter Enterprises. More lawsuits incoming? His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some calls were threats from old business partners who had lost money. Others were lawsuits from former employees who suddenly found the courage to come forward. Then there were the calls from the IRS and federal prosecutors. He ignored them all. For the first time in his life, he had no control. By the end of the week, his mansions were under government investigation. His cars, his luxury properties, even his private jet, all were flagged as potential assets to seize if the case turned criminal. He was trapped. And then the final blow came. Martin Greer, his only remaining ally, called him personally. William, the man's voice was filled with hesitation. I wanted to tell you before you saw the news. William rubbed his forehead. Just say it. Your penthouse was repossessed this morning. William froze. That wasn't possible. That was his home. No, he whispered. No. That's not happening. I'm sorry, William, Martin sighed. But you don't own anything anymore. The call ended. William sat in silence, the weight of everything crushing him. A few months ago, he had been one of the richest men in the country. Now he was homeless. He had nothing left. And for the first time in his life, William Carter had no idea what to do next. The motel room smelled of cheap air freshener and failure. William Carter sat on the edge of the creaky mattress, staring at the stained wallpaper in front of him. A single overhead light flickered weakly, casting shadows of a man he no longer recognized. Just 1 week ago, he had stood at the top of the world. Now he was a man with nothing. His penthouse was gone. His bank accounts were frozen. His business empire had been ripped from his hands. And the media? They were relentless. Every channel, every newspaper, every online platform had turned his ruin into public entertainment. The once feared William Carter was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. And he hated it. His phone, his last connection to his old life, vibrated on the nightstand. He grabbed it instinctively, but the number on the screen made his stomach churn. Unknown caller. It could be the IRS. It could be another lawsuit. Or worse, someone looking to collect a debt. He let it ring. Instead, he scrolled through the messages that had piled up over the past few days. Vanessa, former assistant. I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter. They let me go too. Hope you're okay. Martin Greer. William, the board has voted to dissolve some of your remaining assets. Nothing I can do. Richard Langley, lawyer. William, I tried to slow down the investigation, but the feds aren't backing off. They want blood. And the worst one. His private banker. The last of your personal accounts have been seized. You're officially at zero. William clenched his jaw. Zero. The word made him sick. How had this happened so fast? He had spent decades building an empire, and in days it had crumbled into dust. And now? He couldn't even afford a real meal. The final insult had come earlier that afternoon when his last credit card declined at a gas station. The cashier had recognized him, sneered, and said, "Guess even billionaires run out of luck, huh?" He had wanted to punch the guy's teeth in. Instead, he had left with nothing but a plastic cup of free water. His stomach growled. The few bills he had in his pocket were barely enough to cover another night in this roach-infested motel. If he didn't find something soon, he wouldn't just be broke, he'd be on the streets. And the thought of that terrified him. The next morning, William stepped onto the cold streets of New York, his suit, once a mark of power, now wrinkled and unkempt. He had always looked down on the people who begged for work, the ones who didn't have enough. Now he was one of them. He tried everything. Old business contacts? They wouldn't return his calls. Wealthy friends? They pretended not to know him. Even former employees, people he had once ruled over, refused to help. Sorry, Mr. Carter. Wish I could. You treated us like garbage. Now you need us? Not happening. You had it coming. By the end of the day, William had walked into 10 different offices, trying to find any job that would keep him afloat. Not as a CEO. Not even as a manager. Just something to keep him from sinking further. But the moment people recognized his name, the answers were the same. We're not hiring. You're a liability. You're too much of a risk. He finally understood. No one cared about what he had been. All that mattered was what he was now, and that was nothing. By nightfall, William found himself walking aimlessly through the streets, exhausted and beaten down. He passed a small, modest restaurant, its warm lights glowing against the evening chill. Through the glass windows, he saw customers laughing, enjoying meals, the sound of clinking glasses filling the air. His stomach twisted with hunger. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. A sign near the entrance caught his eye, For a long moment, he just stared at it. Could he really sink this low? Working in a kitchen? He had once owned hotels and five-star restaurants. He had dined with world leaders and billionaire investors. And now, he was considering scrubbing dishes for a few dollars an hour? The idea made him sick. But so did starving to death. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The smell of freshly cooked food hit him instantly, making his stomach cramp. He swallowed his pride, stepped inside, and walked up to the counter. A waitress, probably in her 20s, gave him a quick once-over. Her eyes lingered on his ragged suit, her expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" He cleared his throat. His voice, once commanding, now sounded uncertain. "I saw the sign outside," he said. "You're hiring?" The waitress nodded, then motioned to the back. "Yeah. You'll have to talk to the owner." William exhaled, mentally preparing himself. He had no idea what to expect. But as he stepped through the doorway into the kitchen, he froze. Because standing there, wearing a clean white apron, sleeves rolled up as he prepared plates for customers, was a man he never expected to see again. Ethan Brooks. The same Ethan Brooks he had mocked in court. The same man he had fired without a second thought. Now, Ethan owned this entire place. And he was staring right at him. For the first time since his fall began, William felt true humiliation. He braced himself for the moment he had feared the most, the moment when the man he once destroyed would decide whether to show him mercy or let him drown. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The sounds of the kitchen, the sizzle of meat on the grill, the clatter of plates, the faint hum of conversation from the dining area, seemed distant. William Carter, the once untouchable billionaire, stood frozen in the doorway of a restaurant he wouldn't have glanced at twice in his old life. And the man standing before him? Ethan Brooks. The same Ethan Brooks he had fired without a second thought. The same Ethan Brooks he had smirked at in the courtroom, convinced the lawsuit was a joke. Now, the roles were reversed. Ethan stood tall in his clean chef's jacket, the name Brooks & Co. embroidered neatly on the front. His hands were dusted with flour from the dough he had been kneading, and there was an unmistakable confidence in his stance, the kind of confidence William had once owned. But William? He was barely standing. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained, his once polished shoes scuffed from days of walking the city looking for work. The weight of hunger, exhaustion, and humiliation sat heavily on his shoulders. Ethan wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, his expression unreadable. "William Carter," he said finally, his voice even and calm. "Never thought I'd see you here." William swallowed hard. This was it. The moment he had feared most, being at the mercy of a man he had once crushed. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. "I saw the sign outside. You're hiring." Ethan tilted his head, studying him. "You want a job?" William forced himself to hold Ethan's gaze. I need one." The words burned coming out of his mouth. A year ago, he wouldn't have imagined begging for work, especially from a man like Ethan. But this wasn't a year ago. This was now. And now, William Carter had nothing left. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to one of the cooks. "Tomas, take over for me for a second." Tomas, a burly man in his 50s, nodded and stepped in. Ethan then gestured toward a small table in the corner of the kitchen. "Sit." William hesitated before obeying. Ethan pulled up a chair across from him. "Tell me something," Ethan said, resting his elbows on the table. "How did it come to this?" William tensed. He had hoped Ethan wouldn't ask. But of course he would. There had been a time when William had controlled every conversation, every negotiation. He could spin a situation to his advantage, make people believe whatever he wanted. But this? This wasn't a business deal. This was his life, his fall from grace, and no amount of charm or manipulation could rewrite what had happened. So, for the first time in years, William told the truth. "I lost everything," he admitted, his voice hollow. "The lawsuits. The federal investigation. The board turned on me. They froze my assets. I don't have a cent to my name." Ethan didn't react. William clenched his hands into fists. "I've been looking for work. No one will hire me." He let out a bitter laugh. "Turns out people don't want to take a risk on a guy whose name is in every financial scandal headline." Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You treated people like they were disposable," he said simply. "Now you're seeing what it's like to be on the other side." William's jaw tightened. He had expected that. He had expected anger, maybe even satisfaction. And honestly, he deserved it. But instead of rubbing it in, Ethan sighed and shook his head. "I'll be honest, William. I never thought I'd see you like this." "Yeah, well," William muttered, "neither did I." For a long time, Ethan was silent. Then, to William's shock, he said, "You can start tomorrow." William's head snapped up. "What?" "The job," Ethan said. "You can have it. If you want it." A flicker of hope, a feeling William had nearly forgotten, ignited in his chest. But it didn't last, because that flicker was quickly replaced by something else. Shame. A year ago, he had been one of the richest men in the country. Now, he was being offered a job in a kitchen. And worse, he was considering taking it. Ethan seemed to read his mind. "You don't have to take it," he said. "You can walk out that door and keep pretending you're still the same guy who owned half the city." William gritted his teeth. But Ethan wasn't done. "Or," he continued, "you can start over." William let out a slow breath. His instinct told him to reject it, to walk away and find something better, something that didn't make him feel like a failure. But deep down he knew. There was nothing better. There was only this job, or nothing at all. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, William nodded. "I'll take it," he said quietly. Ethan nodded back. "Be here at 6 tomorrow morning," he said. "You start as a dishwasher." William flinched. But he didn't argue. Because at the end of the day, it was still better than starving. That night, as he lay in his cheap motel room, William stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He had built skyscrapers, owned private islands, sat in rooms with presidents and kings. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, he'd be washing dishes in a small restaurant owned by a man he had once mocked and destroyed. How the hell did it come to this? But there was no turning back. Tomorrow, for the first time in his life, William Carter was going to have to serve, not command. And whether he could survive it was another question entirely. Morning came too soon. The motel's thin curtains did little to block the early light, and William Carter woke with a dull ache in his body, a mixture of exhaustion and hunger. He had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the reality of his new existence. Every instinct in him had screamed that this was temporary, that he would find a way back, that men like him didn't stay down for long. But the truth was unavoidable. There was no miraculous comeback waiting for him. The empire he had spent decades building had crumbled, and no one was offering him a lifeline. He showered in the cramped motel bathroom, the water pressure weak, the soap cheap and barely lathering. As he dressed in the only decent clothes he had left, a wrinkled button-down and dark slacks, he caught his reflection in the cracked mirror. He looked older, as if the past weeks had stolen years from him. The sharp confidence that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something hollow. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaled deeply, and left for his first day at Brooks & Co. The restaurant was already bustling when he arrived. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread, sizzling bacon, and brewed coffee. Servers moved quickly between tables, and in the open kitchen, cooks barked orders at one another. The place had a warmth to it, a kind of energy William had never noticed in restaurants before. To him, places like this had always been beneath him. He had owned establishments far more exclusive, places where meals cost more than what most people earned in a week. Yet, for all the luxury his past life had afforded him, he had never experienced this. The hum of honest, hard work, the quiet satisfaction of people doing something they loved. Ethan was already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flipping through order tickets. When he spotted William, he didn't smirk, didn't offer any snide remarks. Instead, he simply nodded toward the back. Dishwashing station is over there. Sink, soap, racks. Tomas will show you the routine. William barely managed a stiff nod before heading in the direction Ethan had indicated. The dishwashing area was tucked into a tight corner near the back of the kitchen, a stainless steel sink filled with steaming water, dishes stacked high beside it. Tomas, the older cook from the day before, eyed him but said nothing at first. He was a broad-shouldered man with deep lines on his face, the kind of man who had likely spent his whole life working in places like this. "Start with those plates," Tomas finally said, pointing at the tallest stack. "Scrub hard before loading them into the machine. If the chef pulls out a plate with grease still on it, you'll hear about it." William nodded and rolled up his sleeves. As soon as he plunged his hands into the hot, soapy water, a deep, almost violent frustration twisted in his chest. This was it. He was washing dishes in the back of a restaurant, a place he wouldn't have set foot in just months ago. He wasn't strategizing multi-million-dollar deals, wasn't negotiating power plays in boardrooms, wasn't controlling anything. His world had shrunk to the size of a sink full of dirty plates. Hours passed in a slow, repetitive rhythm. Wash, rinse, load. Wash, rinse, load. The kitchen was loud, chaotic at times, and though he wasn't at the center of it, he could feel the occasional glance from the staff. Some of them whispered to each other, no doubt recognizing him, but none of them said anything. He wasn't sure if their silence was out of pity or amusement. By the end of the shift, his back ached, his hands were raw, and the smell of dishwater clung to his skin. He had never been this physically exhausted in his life. He had spent years sitting in executive chairs, dictating orders to people who did the kind of labor he had just done for 10 straight hours. And now, he was one of them. As the last of the evening customers left and the kitchen staff began their closing routine, William was wiping down the last of the trays when Ethan approached, leaning against the counter. "You didn't quit," Ethan said, watching him. William's first instinct was to snap back with some sharp remark, but the truth was, he was too damn tired. He just shook his head. Ethan studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I'll be honest, Carter. I didn't think you'd last the day." William forced a bitter smile. "Neither did I." Ethan nodded toward the dining area. "Come on. Sit for a minute." William hesitated but followed. The dining room was empty now, the chairs stacked on some of the tables, the lights dimmed. Ethan placed 2 beers on the counter and slid one toward William before sitting across from him. William took the bottle without a word, twisting off the cap and taking a long sip. It was cheap, the kind of beer he wouldn't have touched in his old life. Now, it might as well have been champagne. Ethan took a drink of his own before leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I've got a proposition for you." William raised a brow. "I already have a job here. Unless you're offering a promotion, I don't see what else there is to discuss." Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "You were a ruthless bastard, Carter. I remember how you ran your company. You didn't just fire people, you humiliated them. You made sure they felt small. And I was one of them." William remained silent. He wasn't going to defend himself. He had done exactly that. Ethan continued, his tone even. "Most people in your position wouldn't have taken this job. They would have starved before swallowing their pride. And yet, here you are." William stared at him. "What are you getting at?" Ethan exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "I'm giving you a chance, Carter. A real one. Not just washing dishes." William frowned, intrigued despite himself. "What kind of chance?" Ethan leaned back. "You have business experience. That much I can't deny. This restaurant? I built it from nothing, but I know there's room to grow. You want more than dishwashing? Prove you can be useful. Help me expand this place. Help me run it." For a moment, William didn't know what to say. This was insane. A month ago, he had been CEO of an empire. And now, this was his shot at rebuilding? Not in skyscrapers or high-rise offices, but here, in the back of a small restaurant? His pride rebelled at the thought. But so did the reality of what he had become. He had nothing. No money. No options. No future. And here was Ethan Brooks, the man he had once destroyed, offering him a lifeline. William took another sip of his beer, staring at the worn wood of the table. When he finally looked up, there was something in his expression that hadn't been there for a long time. Not arrogance. Not bitterness. Something closer to humility. "You're serious?" William asked. Ethan nodded. "One condition, though." William raised a brow. "What's that?" Ethan leaned in slightly, his gaze steady. "You work for it." William exhaled slowly. And for the first time since his fall, he nodded without hesitation. The next morning, William Carter arrived at Brooks & Co. earlier than anyone else. The restaurant was still dark, the closed sign hanging in the window, the city just beginning to wake outside. For years, he had been the kind of man who arrived late to meetings while others waited on him. Now, he was the first one through the door, standing in the silence of a place that no longer smelled of power and wealth but of flour, grease, and freshly brewed coffee. Ethan arrived shortly after, his keys jingling as he unlocked the back entrance. He wasn't surprised to see William waiting there. He simply gave him a nod, as if acknowledging that the real work was about to begin. "You're early," Ethan said. "You said I had to work for it," William replied. "So here I am." Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "All right then. Let's see what you're really made of." William's first week as more than a dishwasher was brutal. Ethan didn't hand him a managerial position, didn't put him in an office to organize spreadsheets or oversee business strategy. Instead, he threw him into the heart of the work, chopping vegetables, carrying bags of flour, sweeping floors, unloading heavy shipments. His once soft hands, accustomed only to signing contracts and shaking hands at exclusive events, became blistered and rough. His back ached in ways he had never known. The worst part wasn't the labor itself. It was the eyes of the staff, people who had heard his name in the news, who knew exactly who he had been. Some of them resented him, watching with amusement as the former billionaire scrubbed greasy pans and mopped floors. Others simply ignored him, treating him like just another worker. For the first time in his life, no one cared who he was. And that, more than anything, was what cut him the deepest. Yet, as the days passed, something strange began to happen. He found himself adapting. At first, every task felt like a punishment, every scrape and ache a reminder of how far he had fallen. But then, he stopped thinking about that. He stopped thinking about his old life entirely and focused on the work in front of him. The rhythm of the kitchen became familiar, almost comforting in its own way. The sounds, the clatter of plates, the hiss of food on the grill, the shouted orders, became part of him. He started moving faster, learning how to handle a knife without hesitation, how to carry trays without dropping them. And though Ethan rarely praised him, William could tell. He was watching, noticing the changes. One night, after a particularly busy shift, Ethan approached him as he was wiping down the counters. The last customers had left, the dining room was quiet, and the two of them stood in the empty kitchen. "You lasted longer than I expected," Ethan admitted, tossing him a cold bottle of beer. William caught it and let out a dry chuckle. "I thought about quitting every day." "But you didn't," Ethan said. "That's something." William exhaled. "I guess I don't have the luxury of quitting anymore." Ethan studied him for a moment. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe you're finally starting to understand something." William frowned. "And what's that?" Ethan leaned against the counter, his voice quiet but firm. "That there's more to life than power." William didn't respond, because for the first time he wasn't sure if he disagreed. As the weeks turned into months, something inside William began to shift. For the first time in his life, he was working not for money, not for power, but simply to keep going. There was no networking, no strategizing, no manipulating people to get ahead. It was just him and the work. And something about that felt real in a way his old life never had. He started talking to the other staff members, learning their names, hearing their stories. Some of them had been through struggles he couldn't even fathom. Single mothers working double shifts, immigrants trying to build a life from nothing, college students juggling 2 jobs just to afford rent. They worked hard, harder than he ever had in his entire career, and for a fraction of what he used to earn in a single hour. And the more he saw it, the more ashamed he felt of the way he had treated people in the past. One night, as he helped close the restaurant, he found himself standing at the front counter, looking out the window at the city beyond. A year ago he had owned that city. He had walked those streets knowing he was untouchable. Now, he was just another person trying to survive in it. And maybe, for the first time, that was exactly what he needed to be. Ethan was true to his word. After 3 months of hard work, he pulled William aside one afternoon. The restaurant was in its usual afternoon rush, the kitchen a blur of movement, but Ethan spoke quietly, his words carrying weight. "I think it's time," he said. William set down the plate he was drying. "Time for what?" Ethan crossed his arms. "You know this place now. You know how it runs. I've seen you pick up things most people don't. You want that chance to do more? You've earned it." William felt a strange feeling in his chest, something like pride, but not the hollow, self-important kind he used to chase. It was something deeper. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're not a dishwasher anymore," Ethan said simply. "You're the new assistant manager." William blinked. Of all the things he had expected, this hadn't been one of them. A year ago, being the assistant manager of a restaurant would have been insulting. Now, it felt like something real, something he had actually earned. And for the first time since his fall, William Carter felt something he had thought he had lost forever. A sense of purpose. William Carter stepped into Brooks & Co. That morning not as a dishwasher, not as a disgraced billionaire clawing for survival, but as the restaurant's new assistant manager. The title wasn't grand, wasn't dripping in prestige like CEO or President of Carter Enterprises, but it meant something. It wasn't handed to him through influence or fear. It wasn't the result of manipulating board members or crushing competitors. It was earned, plate by plate, shift by shift, hour by grueling hour. Ethan had given him a chance, but he hadn't given him anything else. William had worked for this. He had scrubbed floors, taken out trash, learned to handle kitchen equipment, and memorized every detail of how the restaurant functioned. He had felt the weight of real labor, something he had never respected before. And now he was part of it. Being assistant manager meant more responsibilities. Instead of just washing dishes or cleaning tables, William now handled inventory, payroll, scheduling, and customer service issues. He worked alongside the servers, stepped in when the kitchen was overwhelmed, and made sure the business ran smoothly. It was nothing like his old position at Carter Enterprises. Back then, leadership had meant commanding from a distance, firing people without a second thought, making ruthless decisions to maximize profits, ensuring his own power remained untouched. But here, leadership meant being on the front lines. It meant helping when the kitchen ran behind, cleaning up when a customer spilled something, stepping in when a waitress was overwhelmed. It wasn't about control. It was about trust. And William began to understand something. People didn't follow you because they feared you. They followed you because they respected you. For the first time in his life, he was earning that respect the right way. One night, after closing, Ethan and William sat at the front counter, nursing cold beers. The restaurant was quiet, the chairs stacked on the tables, the scent of grilled food still lingering in the air. Ethan leaned back against the counter, glancing at William. "You know, I wasn't sure you'd make it this far." William smirked. "Neither was I." Ethan studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "You're not the same guy I met in that courtroom." William exhaled, rolling the bottle between his fingers. "No, I'm not." It wasn't something he had planned to say. It wasn't even something he had realized until that moment. But it was true. The man who had walked into that courtroom months ago had been arrogant, untouchable, convinced of his own superiority. That man had believed he was above consequence, above accountability. That man was dead. Ethan smirked. "I gotta admit, it's been kind of satisfying watching you scrub floors after everything." William laughed, a real, genuine laugh. The kind he hadn't had in years. "I deserved it," he admitted. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, you did." A comfortable silence stretched between them. Finally, Ethan exhaled. "I used to hate you, you know." William nodded. "I know." Ethan took another sip of his beer, staring at the dim lights of the restaurant. "But now, I think I actually respect you." William didn't reply right away, because that meant more to him than he wanted to admit. The restaurant was doing better than ever, and William had played a part in that. He had taken his business experience, the strategic mind that once built an empire, and used it for something different. He helped Ethan with cost efficiency, marketing, and customer engagement. He found ways to improve workflow in the kitchen, ways to reduce waste and maximize profits without sacrificing quality. For the first time in his life, his skills weren't being used to crush people beneath him, they were being used to lift something up. And that felt good. But despite everything he had gained, he still lived in a tiny rented apartment, still rode the subway instead of being chauffeured, still worked long hours with sore feet. And yet, he didn't miss his old life. Not the way he thought he would. Because for the first time, he wasn't waking up in a penthouse filled with emptiness. He was waking up with purpose. One evening, Ethan pulled him aside, his expression serious. "I've been thinking," he said. "This place has grown. More than I ever expected. And I know that's because of you." William frowned. "I just helped." "You rebuilt yourself here," Ethan interrupted. "And you helped build this place into something stronger." He hesitated before continuing. "I want you to be a partner." William froze. "What?" Ethan exhaled. 50-50. Co-owners. William stared at him, stunned. It didn't make sense. He had spent years destroying people like Ethan, using businesses like this as stepping stones to build his empire. And now, the man he had once ruined was offering him a place beside him. A real place. Not charity. Not a favor. A partnership. A year ago, William would have laughed at the idea of running a small business. But now, it felt like the only thing that mattered. Finally, William nodded. "I'm in." And just like that, his real second chance began. The morning after Ethan's offer, William Carter found himself staring at his own reflection in the mirror of his small apartment. He barely recognized the man who looked back at him. The once impeccable businessman, who had worn suits tailored to perfection, was now dressed in a simple button-down and work pants. The lines on his face had deepened, not from stress or exhaustion, but from something else, something that felt unsettlingly close to contentment. The idea of being a co-owner of Brooks & Co. was still sinking in. Just a year ago, the thought of running a modest restaurant would have been beneath him. Now, it was the most meaningful offer he had ever received. This wasn't a billion-dollar empire, wasn't an untouchable corporation built on ruthless decisions, but somehow it felt more real than anything he had ever been part of before. When he arrived at the restaurant, Ethan was already there, seated at a booth in the back with stacks of paperwork spread out in front of him. The morning rush had yet to start, the dining area still quiet except for the faint sound of the kitchen staff prepping for the day. William slid into the seat across from him, exhaling slowly. "So," Ethan said, not looking up from the documents. "You thought about it?" William nodded. "Yeah." Ethan finally glanced up. "And?" William took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm in. But I want to do more than just run the restaurant. I want to help expand it. More locations, a bigger reach, something sustainable. This place has potential, Ethan. Real potential." Ethan smirked slightly. "So you're already thinking like a businessman again?" William let out a short laugh. "It's the one thing I was always good at." Ethan nodded, considering his words. "All right. We do this, we do it right. No shortcuts. No screwing people over to get ahead." William met his gaze, knowing exactly what he meant. "That's not who I am anymore." Ethan studied him for a moment before finally extending his hand across the table. William took it without hesitation. The following months were some of the most challenging yet rewarding of William's life. He and Ethan worked side by side, not as adversaries, not as employer and employee, but as true partners. William brought in his business expertise, restructuring finances, streamlining operations, and identifying key areas for expansion. They worked tirelessly to open a second location on the other side of the city. Unlike the high-end restaurants William had once owned, this wasn't about attracting the elite. It was about building something real, something that mattered to the community. For the first time in his life, William wasn't chasing numbers. He was building relationships. He got to know the suppliers, the staff, the customers who came in every day. He learned the names of the college students who worked double shifts, the single parents balancing two jobs, the older cooks who had spent their lives in kitchens, unseen and unappreciated. And the more he listened, the more he understood how blind he had been for most of his life. These were the people he had ignored, the ones he had never thought about while sitting in his high-rise office. But they were the backbone of the world, the ones who kept everything running. And for the first time, he was one of them. It didn't take long for people to start talking about the former billionaire-turned-restaurant owner. The media tried to sensationalize it, digging for some kind of scandal, but there was none to find. William wasn't running from the past. He wasn't pretending to be the same powerful man he once was. He had changed. And people noticed. Investors who had once abandoned him reached out, offering funding if he ever wanted to return to the corporate world. Former colleagues tried to arrange meetings, speaking in cautious tones, testing the waters to see if he was interested in reclaiming his old life. But William turned them all down, because he no longer needed that life. He had spent years believing that power, influence, and untouchable wealth were the only measures of success. But standing behind the counter of his own restaurant, shaking hands with customers, watching a business grow from the ground up with honesty and hard work, this was success. Not in the way he had once defined it, but in the way that actually mattered. Months passed, and Brooks & Co. continued to thrive. By the time they were preparing to open their third location, Ethan made an announcement that caught William by surprise. "I'm getting married," he said one evening after closing, standing behind the bar with a satisfied grin. William raised an eyebrow, setting down his drink. "Didn't realize you were even seeing someone seriously." Ethan smirked. "That's because I have a life outside of work. You should try it sometime." William chuckled. "Congratulations." When's the wedding? 3 months from now. And before you start thinking of excuses, you're coming. William hesitated. He hadn't been to a real wedding in years, not since the days when invitations came embroidered in gold and featured guest lists filled with politicians, billionaires, and celebrities. This would be different. Real. A few months later, he found himself seated in a small but beautiful venue, surrounded by people who had become more like family than colleagues. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt, and filled with genuine love, something William had rarely seen in the world he used to inhabit. But it was at the reception where something truly unexpected happened. As he stepped away from the crowd to get a drink, a familiar voice spoke from behind him. "I never thought I'd see you here." William turned sharply, his breath catching for a moment. Standing there, dressed in an elegant navy blue dress, was Sophie Carter, his younger sister. His heart pounded in his chest. They hadn't spoken in years. Not since his rise to power had consumed every aspect of his life. She had always been different from him, choosing a quiet life away from wealth and status, and they had drifted apart long before his downfall. "Sophie," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. She studied him carefully before offering a small smile. "You look different." William exhaled, shaking his head. "I am different." She nodded slowly. "I can see that." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of years of distance between them. But then, to his surprise, Sophie stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "I'm glad you found your way back," she whispered. William closed his eyes, feeling something that went deeper than redemption. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a man trying to reclaim his power. He was a man who had finally reclaimed himself. William Carter never thought he would enjoy something as simple as standing in the middle of a crowded wedding reception, listening to laughter, clinking glasses, and the murmur of conversation. But here he was, sipping a modest glass of bourbon, feeling more at peace than he ever had in a skyscraper filled with executives waiting for his orders. Across the room, Ethan Brooks stood with his new wife, laughing as old friends clapped him on the back. The restaurant owner, once just another name in a long list of employees William had discarded, had become his friend, his business partner, and, in an unexpected way, his lifeline. And beside William, still watching him with cautious curiosity, was his sister, Sophie. It had been years since they had last spoken, years since she had given up on trying to break through his arrogance, on trying to remind him that there was more to life than money and control. Now, as she studied the man in front of her, William could tell she was still trying to understand who he had become. "I kept up with the news about you," Sophie finally said, breaking the silence between them. "It was hard not to. You were everywhere." William exhaled slowly. "I can imagine." "You were the definition of untouchable," she continued. "Then, in the blink of an eye, you weren't." William nodded. "Yeah, that's how it felt for me, too." She tilted her head slightly. "And now?" He looked around the reception, at the warmth in the room, the people who had come together not out of obligation, not because they had something to gain, but because they genuinely cared. "Now," he said, "I think losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me." Sophie blinked, clearly surprised by his answer. "Really?" William smiled, but there was no bitterness in it. "I was so focused on power, on being at the top, that I never realized how empty it all was. I thought respect came from fear, from control. But that wasn't respect. It was just people waiting for the moment they could replace me." Sophie softened, nodding slowly. "So what does respect mean to you now?" William glanced toward Ethan, who was still deep in conversation, then toward a small group of Brooks & Co. employees seated at one of the tables. They were laughing, drinking, celebrating. Not one of them feared him. Not one of them was there because they had to be. "Respect," William said, "is something you earn when you stop thinking you deserve it." After the wedding, William returned to the only home he had now, a small, comfortable apartment above the first Brooks & Co. location. The restaurant had grown beyond anything Ethan had imagined, expanding to 3 locations, with discussions for more. William had been instrumental in its growth, using his business acumen for the first time in a way that didn't destroy people, but lifted them up. His days were long, his work demanding, but unlike before, there was satisfaction in it. No offshore accounts, no tax loopholes, no corrupt dealings behind closed doors. Just honest, hard work. One afternoon, while reviewing expansion plans for a potential 4th restaurant, he received a call from an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello." A familiar voice greeted him, one he hadn't heard since the worst moment of his downfall. "William." It was Martin Greer, his former board member, the only one who had hesitated before voting him out. William leaned back in his chair. "I was wondering when someone from that world would finally call." Martin sighed. "I won't waste your time. I'm here with an opportunity." William smirked. "Of course you are." "The dust has settled," Martin continued. "People are starting to talk. There's an opening in the market, and with your name attached, we could build something big again. Investors are interested. I'm offering you a way back in." William let the words settle. A year ago, he would have jumped at the chance. The very idea of rebuilding his empire would have been irresistible. But now, he found himself feeling nothing. He looked around his office, the modest but well-worn wooden desk, the walls covered in plans for Brooks & Co.'s expansion. He thought about the people who had helped him rebuild his life, the team he had become part of. He thought about the life he had now, one built on real respect, real effort, real meaning. Then he thought about the life he had lost, the betrayals, the paranoia, the endless chase for more. And he realized that, for the first time in his life, he didn't want it back. "Martin," William said, his voice steady, "I appreciate the call. But I'm exactly where I want to be." There was a long pause on the other end. "You're serious?" "Yeah," William said, glancing down at the paperwork in front of him. Plans for a future he actually believed in. "I am." Martin chuckled, though there was something almost disbelieving in it. "Well, I never thought I'd hear William Carter turn down power." William smiled to himself. "Then I guess you never really knew me at all." He ended the call, setting his phone down. There was no rush of regret, no second-guessing his decision. Just clarity. He wasn't the William Carter of old anymore. That man had died the day he lost everything. And in his place, someone better had been born. The years that followed were the best of his life. Brooks & Co. continued to expand, not as a soulless corporation, but as a business built on integrity, on care, on real leadership. William never became a billionaire again, never reclaimed his position as a titan of industry. And he didn't want to. Because for the first time, he wasn't chasing wealth. He was living a life worth something. The name William Carter was no longer spoken with fear or contempt. It was spoken with respect, not because he was powerful, but because he had finally learned what it meant to be a man worth respecting.